Hey everyone, welcome to the Customer Success webinar series. I'm Scott Slomba, Head of Customer Success here at Komprise, and with me is Paul Chen, Head of Product Management. This week we're going to be discussing a new feature that just came out before the holidays called Hypertransfer. This feature significantly improves WAN migrations over SMB. Quick reminder before we get started, the intent of this webinar series is to update existing customers on Komprise new features, new use cases, and best practices. So, this is not a sales pitch. It's not a marketing pitch. It's just a nuts and bolts discussion for existing customers to help you best use Komprise. Basically make the most out of your subscription. Before we get started, we got a few logistics. If you haven't figured it out, on the upper right-hand side of your screen, there's I don't know what you call that, a square bracket that'll put you to full screen mode, so that'll give you a better viewing experience. We want to keep this interactive, so please ask questions. You won't be able to ask questions audibly. You'll have to ask questions via text. So click on the question mark icon on the right and ask away, and we'll address your questions as we go along. We will be asking some polls along the way. So again, another icon, the poll icon you'll see there, so you can click on that to respond to the polls. We also have some assets that we think would be useful for the audience. So if you look at the paperclip icon, there's some items there. And then finally, we're always asked if this is going to be recorded, and it is. And we've got a link right here at komprise.com/techcrunch. Another place where you can find the recordings is on Freshdesk. You all should have Freshdesk accounts. If you go to the homepage under announcements, you'll see links to the recordings as well as links to upcoming webinars. And then one final logistic, this is scheduled for 30 minutes. We usually keep it under that time, but if we have some solid dialogue going, questions, we'll stick around later to answer the questions, so we could be running late. So today, agenda, Paul's gonna be talking about Hypertransfer, kind of walk you through, how it works, the architecture and all that. And then he's got a demonstration. And then, again, ask questions along the way, but we'll have time at the end for Q&A. And then we want to get your feedback for future topics, anything that would help, anything we could dig deeper into. Again, we're happy to go deeper into existing topics or whatever. Whatever is going to help you make most use of the product, just let us know, and we'll come back with that. And with that, I will turn it over to Paul.
Thank you very much, Scott. Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining. As Scott mentioned, today we're going to talk about a new Komprise feature called Hypertransfer, and this is going to accelerate migrations over the WAN. But before I get into that, I wanted to do a quick review of a webinar that my colleague Benjamin Henry gave in December about performance considerations for WAN migrations. Now, he gave an excellent talk. If you missed it, highly recommend that you go watch the recording. There was great information provided. But I'm going to give you a 10-second overview of his salient points, because everything he went over in that webinar still holds true, even though we have this new feature for accelerating migrations of WAN over the WAN. Everything that he talked about is still good practices, best practices for things you need to take care of before you actually get into the migration. So let's take a look at some of those points. First, you have to plan your migration. Do you know what you're going to do? Do you know where you're migrating from, where you're migrating to? Create a plan. If you don't have a plan, you're not likely to know when you're done, when you've succeeded. Obviously, you have to know your sources and targets. Where's the data coming from? Where's it going to? Ben talked about rules and regulations, especially when you're migrating over the WAN. You may be likely leaving your four walls, your premises, and going somewhere else, maybe to the cloud, maybe to a colo. There are regulations about moving data. If it's crossing, especially country boundaries, you may have to look at GDPR. So make sure you understand any legal ramifications of the data migration you're about to do. Understanding your data. Ben spent a lot of time talking about what Komprise can do to help you understand the data that you're about to migrate. You can gain insights. You can understand the types of data. Even if some of that data is cold, you may want to think about archiving it before you migrate it somewhere else. All of that is possible using Komprise Data Discovery. And he talked about some of the issues you might have if you don't have this kind of data discovery. He talked about your topology. I mean, the common thought is I'm going to just migrate from my local NAS up to the cloud. There it is, straight line. But Ben spent quite a bit of time educating all of us that it's not that simple. I'm sure all of you realize it's not that simple. There's a lot of equipment along that wire, along that path, and they introduce delays. Komprise Hypertransfer can help with some of this, but obviously anything behind your firewalls, anything inside your ISP still needs to be looked at and tried and optimized if possible. And then finally,
Hey. Oh, Paul,
yes.
I just need to chime in. Yeah, that last one, topology, we see this all the time. So
Oops.
the recommendation is to partner with your networking expert. Quite often someone thinks they have a 10 gig line, and then there's all this junk in between point A and point B that they didn't realize, and things are choked down to a much slower bandwidth. So very, very common thing we ran into.
Thanks, Scott. Yes, we have seen this at many customers, and it's something that we can help them diagnose. I'll get to that in a second. The way that, of course, these kind of scenarios are uncovered are first by testing. So before you do any large-scale migration, obviously it's a good idea to test. And you're not just testing the topology, but you're testing your sources, the read and write times on the targets, testing a small migration to make sure everything goes the way you think. You've got all the permissions set up. Finally, Komprise does have a service that we can provide that we call ACE, the assessment of your customer environment. This can help uncover a lot of the issues that a test might show. And I keep doing that, and I back up and it doesn't go through the bill. Apologies. But essentially, anything that is along the wire, a test might turn up, but the assessment of the customer environment does some very targeted testing to test each step along the way, and we can help you diagnose any problems before you actually start your migration. So all of these things that Ben talked about absolutely still hold true. You should still follow this plan, follow this process for any WAN-based migration. But first, a quick poll. We wanted to find out amongst the audience, how many of you are migrating data to the cloud? Or if not, how soon you might be. So let's start the poll. As Scott mentioned, it's that bar chart icon over on the right. The poll is essentially, are you migrating data to the cloud? And the responses are, yes, I am, or not yet, but soon, within 1 to 3 months, within a quarter. Not yet, maybe within 2 quarters, and then maybe not sure if we will. We're thinking about it, and then we're interested if some of you out there are thinking, we're never going to put our data in the cloud. We can't. It has to stay on-prem. That situation we know exists. And we're just curious to find out what percentage of people have this. So we'll let that poll run a bit. And meanwhile, I'll continue on. We do have many customers actually trying to migrate data over the WAN, whether up to a cloud file server, or in some cases, even to a remote site or a co-location facility. What they're finding is, of course, it's different than migrating between storage on premises. On-prem, everything's connected by the LAN. It hides a lot of the issues because everything's very fast. When you're migrating across a WAN, if you've got billions of files that you're trying to migrate, and many of them are small, you'll find there'll be performance issues. There's a high latency WAN connectivity, which exacerbates any performance issues and exacerbates the problems with small files. And then particularly, the SMB protocol is what we call quite chatty. There's quite a lot of back and forth acknowledgements and handshakes that go between the source and the destination. Of course, now all of those are traveling over the WAN, over the latency, and you can see obviously that you're going to have performance issues. And this is what Komprise is focused on, to help you do your migrations faster. Here's a notional diagram of what your migration looks like with a Komprise deployment. You have your Komprise director. Of course, you have your source filers over on the left. This is your storage on premises. Your apps and your users are accessing that data. But now you want to migrate some data up into the cloud, and those are represented by the small clouds over on the right. There's a wide variety of cloud filers available to you now. There are more coming online every week, every month. Azure and Amazon are probably the most popular versions right now. You'll make use of the Komprise grid, the observers and proxies, but you'll notice that red line from your on-premises situation up into the cloud. That's the WAN that we're talking about, the slow pipe, high latency, potentially low bandwidth. And that's the part that Komprise is focused on to help your migrations run faster. This is the long pole in your WAN migration. So what we've done is we've created this feature. We call it Hypertransfer. It optimizes your migrations over the WAN. And in our lab, we've measured that it's 25 times faster than Robocopy on that first all-important baseline copy where all the data gets copied for the first time. And then, of course, since your file systems tend to be live and you've got users in there making changes, adding, deleting, modifying files, directories, Komprise runs consecutive iterations of the migration to catch those changes. And for those subsequent iterations, we find that we're about 22 times faster than Robocopy. And these, again, are our measurements within the lab conditions. But when we got this out in the field with customers, they're noticing that same orders of magnitude speed up using Hypertransfer than without. So it's pretty exciting. Again, what this looks like in the diagram, that slow red pipe is now replaced. Obviously, we still have to travel over the WAN. There's no secret there. We can't build a hyper tunnel or a worm or anything. We're still using the same network, but we now have a dedicated channel set up by Komprise using a Komprise protocol to send the data in a much more efficient manner from your on-prem sources up into the cloud or your remote file servers. So that's the secret sauce of Hypertransfer. In order to affect this speed up, we have to add something we call a Komprise zone. This is something that you're going to define. It helps tell Komprise, hey, I've got this storage over here, and I'm going to migrate it to this remote location. Essentially, you're defining a zone for each of those two locations. Conceptually, within a zone, you've got very high connectivity. So behind your firewall, that's one zone, high connectivity on your LAN. In the remote destination, whether it's in a cloud, Azure, Amazon, or a remote colo, within that facility, presumably you also have fast interconnectivity. So each of those would be its own zone. You define those, you set those up in Komprise, and then you tell us which storage is in which zone. Similarly, if you've got SMB, you'll need a Windows proxy to help manage that data. You'll set one up in the remote site, and you'll put that in the zone as well. And then Komprise just sets up those migrations using a dedicated channel between those zones. And so what that looks like, same diagram, but now you'll see these dashed ovals are defining the zones. So everything on-prem is automatically put into what we call the default zone. That's already done for you. Every on-prem source filer, all your observers, all your proxies by default end up in the quote-unquote default zone. Once you've decided where you're migrating to, your destination, then you, in Komprise, set up a new zone for that remote destination. You'll add your destination filer to it. In this case, it is an Azure Files. And then you'll put a Windows proxy there as well. So now you've got two zones defined. The way that the migration will work, let's take a specific example. Suppose you have an on-prem NetApp and you want to migrate it up to Azure Files in the cloud. As I mentioned, your on-prem NetApp will already be in the default zone. You already have Windows proxies configured and deployed. Those will also be in the default zone. The new thing you will do is add your Azure Files. You'll add it to Komprise, and you'll also assign it to a new zone. You can call it anything you like. Here, I'm just making an example. We'll call it Azure US East. Then you'll configure a Komprise Windows proxy also in that Azure East region and assign it to the same zone. Everything after that is normal. You configure your migration as usual. Komprise will recognize you are migrating between zones, will automatically set up that Hypertransfer dedicated channel and accelerate your migration. And again, the way that it looks in the picture, everything on-prem is in the default zone. The Komprise protocol is being used over the dedicated channel, and we're sending the data much faster up to Azure East. Again, over 20 times faster than Robocopy can.
Hey, Paul, couple
Yes.
questions came in. I think one of the, well, let's see. First one, does this require Komprise proxy on the target side? And I think that question came in before you answered that, but the answer there is yes.
Right. If you're sending SMB data, we'll need a proxy on the other side. The reason is that this Komprise protocol is a proprietary dedicated protocol. So the proxy in the default zone on-prem is sending now information in a proprietary protocol. We need a proxy on the other end to receive that protocol, unpack it, and send the commands over to the file server.
And then the next question was, how do zones work with sites? And I think you just explained that as well.
Actually, let me get into that a bit. That's a great question. Komprise does support multiple sites. So in the Komprise UI, in the director, you can set up multiple sites, each site having its own storage. And the way that zones work is zones are local to sites. So you can have the same name for a zone in site 1 and reuse that name in site 2. Sites are restricted to their scope to a particular, zones are restricted in the scope to a particular site.
And you can have more than one filer at a site. So it's not a,
Exactly.
yeah.
It's not a one-to-one. Once you define a zone, you can fill it with as many filers and proxies as you need. Of course, subject to the constraint that they should all be on a fast interconnectivity network within that zone. The zone is really a region of high network connectivity.
All right. More questions are coming in. The next one is, can we put the observers/proxies in the cloud target instead of on-prem? Scoping a 60-site consolidation into Azure and putting observers in the source does not make sense.
Okay, probably we should go take that offline and talk about your specific use case. However, for your source filers, we do need observers and proxies if it's SMB on the network close to those source filers, because something has to read those source filers quickly, send the data in our dedicated channel protocol up to the cloud. So essentially, a Komprise deployment has always used a Komprise grid of observers and proxies near the source storage. When you're doing a traditional on-prem to on-prem migration, that's all you need, because the observers and proxies are sitting in the storage and they read the data and write the data all locally to that quote unquote default zone. Now, when you're crossing zones, you'll have to add the proxy in the remote zone.
Okay. Yeah, we don't have visibility into who's asking the question. So we do have an alias, customersuccess@komprise.com. So if we're not completely answering the question, or if you want to have a deeper dialogue, just fire over that alias, and we'll follow up with you. So hopefully
I do see one other question, and it's very relevant to this slide. We're showing the migration up to an Azure filer. Are we limited to Azure filers? Absolutely not. I'm using this just as an example. It's actually any cloud filer. So it can be an Amazon, it could be any other vendor's cloud filer, as long as it's standard NFS or SMB. But even further than that, it doesn't have to be a cloud provider. It can just be a remote destination that you need to migrate data to. It just happens to be going over the internet. So it can be your own colo, it can be your own remote site. So you could be migrating, say, from Austin, Texas to Paris, if you happen to have a site there and you need to migrate the data. Anything over the WAN, this Hypertransfer will accelerate.
Actually, they keep coming in, Paul. I think we hit a record.
Yeah, I see this next one. Are we still using a proxy for CIFS, SMB, and then not for NFS? In fact, we do need the Windows proxy for handling SMB data, just sort of historically, because the Komprise observers run as a Linux-based virtual appliance. And there's certain things that Linux applications cannot do on a Windows server, just restrictions from Windows server side. So we had to create the Windows proxy to help the observer do things on the Windows server side. We're actually working on technology to obviate the need for the Windows proxy. So look for future updates from us where no longer will you need the Windows proxy. You'll just be deploying observers and they'll be able to handle everything. It's a good point. Right now, we're using Windows proxies to get over that Windows Server limitations. Good questions coming in.
Yeah,
let's see.
great.
This is a long one. Set up the acceleration for the first.
Oh no, actually, look, check out the one below it, Paul.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
This one is relevant to this picture again. So now you've migrated your data from on-prem. It's now in the cloud. Once I migrate my file data to the cloud, can Komprise manage that data? Absolutely. Komprise is a full data management platform, as all of you know, and that file data in the cloud can be managed by Komprise just the same way as Komprise was managing your on-prem files as well. So you just point Komprise to that new filer as a source, and then you can set up archiving from there. You can archive from those cloud filers to cheaper object storage. You can manage that data all the same ways you can manage it with your on-prem filers. Getting the same analytics, the same deep analytics, the same global file index applies to all your cloud filers as well. And then I think finally, this longer question, I'm getting the gist. You set up these Windows proxies in the cloud or in the remote destinations to help with the migration. Once the migration is done, you don't need them any longer. Unless, of course, Komprise will manage that data, which we hardly recommend, in which case you will still need the proxy to help Komprise manage that data. Or if you ever need any further migrations into that zone, you would need a proxy there. But these are elastic. You can stand them up when you need them to migrate. If you're going to continue data management with Komprise, you would keep them. If you're only going to migrate the data and then not touch it after that, you can tear down those Windows proxies. Of course, since they're running in the cloud, they do incur running costs. So I totally understand. They're elastic. You can expand when you need them and tear them down when you don't need them. Okay, I think, do these proxies require hardware? They're in the cloud. So those Windows proxies in the remote destinations, if it's a cloud filer, they will need to run on, you'll need to allocate and provision a remote Windows server. The way those work, of course, there's a piece of hardware somewhere in the cloud. As the definition of cloud is, it's not your computer, it's somebody else's. But, and if it's an on-prem colo somewhere remotely, you'll need the Windows servers to run on a Windows Server platform as well. So yes, at the bottom somewhere there will be some hardware that this Windows proxy will run. How does this work with third-party S3 providers? So today we're talking about file migrations. Maybe we'll table S3 migrations for a different topic. Komprise can handle S3 migrations. At this point, we're talking about migrations of file data from source on-prem source filers up into cloud or remote destination filers. Lots of good questions. If I have one zone, how many proxy servers would you need depending on the migration? So again, Komprise always recommends standing up 2 Windows proxies for high availability, but the number that you need will depend on how many parallel simultaneous migrations you plan to have. So this is something Komprise can help consult with you with, can recommend. It's not a one-to-one relationship. So each migration doesn't need its own Windows proxy. A Windows proxy can handle multiple migrations to multiple different file servers. They're pooled in that remote zone. So if you're running 10 or 15 migrations, you may only need 2 or 3 proxies. But again, it all depends on how much data, how many are running in parallel, etc. So the mileage may vary, and we're glad to help consult with you. And a follow-on question, similar to one we had before, does the proxy in Azure need to be on an Azure VM and always running? It needs to be on an Azure VM because it needs to be running close to your Azure files. So if your Azure files instance is running in US East, then you'll have to provision a Windows server in US East of Azure and then run the Windows proxy there. So it has to be network close to the filer. And it only needs to be running while you're doing the migration or afterwards if you're going to have Komprise continue to manage that filer data. Okay, I think I'm going to stop for here. We're already at 9:24 and I didn't even get to the demo yet. So let's get to the demonstration. I will share my screen now and give you a quick view. Of course, I have so many tabs. This is called Plan Atlanta. There. I've logged into the Komprise deployment. This, of course, is a demo situation, so I don't actually have 9 petabytes of data at my disposal. It's all simulated, but it is the product running on top of a data simulator. So as I mentioned, you would add your Azure files to Komprise, and I've already done this. I've got an Azure Files file server with a couple SMB shares. And then I need to make sure that I've got my Windows proxies available. The first thing I'll do, you'll notice this new area called zone. There is a zone called default, so that's why there's one zone. Now I'm going to define a new zone for my Azure US East. And maybe I'll call it 1. Maybe I plan to have 2 or 3 of these at some point at different points. So now I have a second zone. First thing I want to do is assign the proxy to that zone. So I'd already stood up and provisioned a proxy. Imagine this is running in Azure US East. I can now edit that proxy and put it in that new zone. By default, everything ends up in the default zone. I'll add it in that new zone I just created. So now it's showing, we have a new column here showing you that it's in the Azure US East zone. So I have a proxy. The only other thing I need to do is put my Azure filer also in that zone. So right now, when I created it, when I added it to Komprise, by default, it was in the default zone. I can edit it. And now in the zone, I picked the Azure US East. Now that I've created this zone, by the way, anytime I add a file server, suppose I pick Amazon EFS, I can right away put it in the right zone, as long as I've predefined those zones. If I haven't, I can always configure the zones using that link. So now I've got my destination filer set up in the Azure East zone. I've got a proxy set up there. Now I just need to configure my migration. This is normal migration configuration. Let's say I want to get some data off this engineering TrueNAS and get it up to the cloud. So the source will be this TrueNAS SMB share. I'm going to put it into my Corp Azure. There are some settings that I can choose now, and I can also edit the name. Just as mnemonic, I want to remind myself this is the engineering TrueNAS Azure files. I can review and then go. This is all the same that you're used to when you set up a migration. The migration will look the same in our migration table. Here's the migration, engineering TrueNAS to Azure files. I'd already set one up before. I want to show you in a second. But everything else looks the same. Source and destination information we echo. We give you all the information about all the iterations. And so now I want to give you some reminders about Komprise elastic data migrations. Komprise under the covers is now using Hypertransfer to accelerate that migration up into the cloud. But the standard migration features also are still in effect. So for example, we show you for the last 5 iterations, as well as the baseline, all this information that's relevant to each iteration. A point to note, every file that we copy is checked by an MD5 or a SHA-256 or SHA-2 checksum. It's not for encryption, it's not for security, it's for data integrity. Every file that lands on your destination, changes copied. If it doesn't match the checksum, it doesn't stay on the destination. So you're guaranteed at any point in the migration, any file that exists on the destination has already been checked, is guaranteed to match. We don't delay all the checking until, say, the final iteration. We don't try to speed up the migration by not doing checks and then do them all at the end. And then you have this longer iteration that you're trying to do your cutover in when you're doing all these other extra operations. No, we checksum everything along the way. We store those checksums of both source and destination along with their timestamps. So we provide a chain of custody, which is valid at any point during the migration. It's not only valid at the end, it's valid anytime during. You can examine it. Another point is not only do we copy the file content, excuse me, but we'll also copy all the attributes, ACLs, permissions along with. In fact, we're not showing any here because we consider it an atomic action. When we copy a file, we copy everything that goes with it. We don't wait and do the attributes and ACLs at the end, trying to speed up the migration. We do everything along the way. Of course, with a live file system, if someone changes only the attributes or the ACLs, we'll pick that up, and then you'll see numbers of attributes of directories or files, etc., changing over time. But over time, we'll do multiple iterations to try to catch all those things. You'll notice for each iteration, we tell you how long it took or how long it's taking. And you have this visibility across the last 5 iterations. And the average runtime is an average of the last 3. So for iteration 24, its average runtime is the average of 23, 22, and 21. So at any point in time, you have very clear visibility on how long things are going to take. So when you get to that final iteration, you know about how long it's going to take. You don't have to do a dry run. You don't have to test, oh, now I'm going to get the ACLs copied. Now I'm going to get the attributes. Now I'm going to do the checksums. How long will it take? No, we've been doing that all along. The time tells you how long your iterations are taking, and you can plan your cutover without an extra dry run. So all of these things are baked into a Komprise migration. The last point I want to make note of, you may be doing large scale migrations up to the cloud, hundreds of terabytes, even petabytes. Obviously, cloud filers incur a cost, something to think about differently than your on-prem storage. Maybe you don't want to migrate all that data up into the cloud. primarily cost, but also the time. If that data doesn't need to go to the cloud, you're prolonging your migration, so it'll take longer. What we would suggest is if you're not using a point solution, in other words, you're using Komprise, a full solution, you can archive, obviously, from that source filer first. You can use Komprise, set up a plan, and move the cold data to cheaper storage first. And then by the time you do your migration, you only need to migrate the hot data and the links. We call this a smart data migration. You're using Komprise to discover your data, deal with it appropriately, archive the cold data, and then migrate only the hot data. So going back to the slides, that's the demonstration point part. Just a quick note on usage. As I mentioned, you'll have to upgrade to Komprise 4.8. This is where the new hypertransfer functionality is available, along with the user interface that I mentioned. When you do the upgrade, just simply ask Komprise support to enable the feature. We've disabled it by default since not everyone uses it, not yet anyway. Most customers are still doing on-prem migrations. If you need to use it, when you're doing the upgrade, just have Komprise flip the switch. Then you create your new zone for your destination storage and the proxies that you'll put there. Deploy that proxy and assign it to the new zone. Assign your storage to that new zone, and then configure and run your migration as usual. Automatically under the covers, Komprise will use Hypertransfer to really turbocharge and accelerate your WAN migration. Key takeaways. Obviously, Komprise is a full platform. We can help you understand your data before you do this migration. Benjamin Henry had said, make sure you have a plan and know what data you've got. You can do that with Komprise. Beware of point tools. Just to segue to that point, other tools don't give you that kind of analytics. Other tools don't help you archive cold data first and make you migrate everything. With Komprise, you can do smart data migration. It's just a component of our intelligent data management strategy. WAN acceleration is now helping you to get that data wherever it needs to go. Over to you, Scott.
Okay, white paper available. Actually, I can't see the screen. Is there a link on here? I think there's a link on the white paper.
And it's in the assets. If you click the paperclip,
there you go.
it's also linked there.
Sorry, I have a tiny screen and a tiny view here. Yeah, so so we get the white paper on the Hypertransfer, and also as mentioned earlier, I think I got it here. All these webinars are recorded, and you get the link to that at komprise.com. Komprise.com/TechCrunch. And then earlier, we still have time. We're past the hour or past the bottom of the hour, but we have more questions. We'll hang out and answer them. If you got to go, or if you want to dig deeper, right here, customer success at komprise.com on the right-hand side there. Just send a note over there, and we'll follow up, and we can have a deeper dialogue on any of these topics, any of these questions. And I think that's the last slide. Yeah, so Paul, the questions keep trickling in, so maybe
I'm happy to take them. So let me just work down from the top.
Yeah.
Can all the iterations be shown rather than the last 5? So that's an interesting point. We have toyed with the idea of showing all the iterations in the user interface, and you have a really long horizontal scroll bar. What we ended up deciding was that could impact your UI performance. You might be waiting for hundreds of iterations to be shown. So we decided just to keep the last 5 in the user interface, but there's a report you can download, and the CSV will have every iteration and the details for every one. So it is available to you via download. Can we report the MD5 checksum after the migration? Yes, as I mentioned, we are logging the MD5 checksums of both sources and destination files as we go. So they're always available. And so, of course, by the time you've cut over your migration and finished it, all of those logs of the MD5s are still available. So they're available during and after. What is the plan on defining good definition on the errors that migrate logs? I'm not sure I understand that question. So in the interest of time, let me table that. Maybe we'll come back to it.
And that might be a good one to send to customersuccess.com.
Yeah. And we'll copy it. We'll make a note of it.
Yep.
Can Komprise control the cloud proxies as part of a regular migration job? The cloud or the Windows proxies that are used in the cloud, in this case, are used primarily for that migration. we do hope that you will use Komprise to manage that data as well. So in general, the Windows proxies are helping the Komprise platform manage the data in general. So it's not just the migration, it could be part of a plan, a move operation to archive the data, a copy. So it's probably not the right place for the migration to say, okay, I'm done with the migration, you can kill the Windows proxy. The proxy is part of other things that Komprise is doing. So it's really up to the user to decide when that cloud proxy can be either torn down, or if you need more stood up. Does Komprise support cross-site migration? So as I mentioned, Komprise supports multiple sites, and the way that it works is each site is essentially, you can think of it as a physical location of where you have your storage, and you could have storage in Las Vegas, you could have storage in Armonk, New York. Currently, we can support cross-site migration by essentially adding the destination to the source site. We're working on the ability to do cross-site migration the way you would see it in the user interface. It's a little tricky because now we have to get observers in each site involved. Right now, observers in different sites are completely disparate. We need to maintain that distance so that an observer in Las Vegas doesn't try to manage a share in Armonk, right, with that high latency bandwidth over the United States. That's not an optimal configuration. So observers are localized to the storage in their site. We're working on ways to enable cross-site migration, but we have a workaround now. And if you need to do that, let us know. It's absolutely straightforward to do. We have the Wasabi question in S3. We'll table that for a future webinar. Thank you for that topic. And then the last one again is, what is the plan on defining good definition on the errors that migrate logs? So I think the gist of the question is, while the migration is occurring, there could be errors. There could be transient network errors. Of course, over the WAN, this happens quite a lot. Komprise will take note of any error or failure where we are not able to copy the file successfully to the destination. We do log those, and we have, for every iteration, we keep a log of every error that the migration encountered. In the user interface, we'll show you there were errors, and there's a quick CSV you can download that will show you a sample of the different types of errors. But we now have an audit log that's been available for about a year that you can go. It's located in the audit log location, and it will give you a list of every file and every error that we encountered. And we've had customers ask for this because they need to fix every error in order to get all the files successfully migrated so they can do their cutover. So I think that was the gist of the question. If I didn't quite address it, please follow up with an email at customer success, and we're glad to dig into it with you.
And I'll put another plug in there. So just a note is every release. So Komprises on a monthly release cycle, and every release we have new features, but also every release has a pile of enhancements, tuning, whatnot. So error messages are constantly being improved, performance constantly being tweaked, patches, et cetera, et cetera. So highly recommended that your all existing customers to get on some kind of a regular upgrade cadence, quarterly or twice a year or something like that, but definitely less than once a year, because that'll ensure that you'll have the latest and greatest, most performant, best experience. Obviously for Hypertransfer, you need at least 4.8 and above, but if you're not looking at Hypertransfer and just looking at migrations in general, again, I would upgrade first, and before you start doing any heavy duty migrations, just make sure you have the latest and greatest best on board before you get going.
We do have a follow-on on that error log question. So I think the comment is that a lot of the errors come in as categorized as undefined. Again, a lot of the errors that Komprise sees often are happening in layers below us, something on the file server side, something in the API side, something in the network side. Komprise, of course, will try to give a category for each error, whether it's a file server, a source error, a network error, a transient error, high-level categories. But wherever we can't categorize it, we try to pass up the underlying error message. So let's take this one offline. Please contact us. We'd love to dig into those and help you figure out what's going on. The log should help. If you haven't seen the actual error log, it will have the underlying error messages that we're able to pass through. And we'd love to help you learn how to diagnose and fix those.
All right, excellent. Thank you. That concludes the webinar. Lots of great questions. And as you said earlier, it doesn't have to end here. Just fire away at customer success and we'll follow up with deeper dialogue. So thank you very much.
Thank you all very much.
Okay.